Hello everybody, here is another video in our series Why We Serve. This is a little bit more of a skill video. Dealing with grief and loss. This is not an easy topic for anyone, and you might wonder if it's a special topic for dealing with homeless young adults. And I'm going to claim it is because I think homeless young adults have had very few experiences in general in ways to handle grief and loss well. And I say in general because, of course, no one is a cookie cutter. And so we're going to paint with broad brush. But anyway, when I first came to the street, I noticed that when someone passed away, there was no ceremony or process for marking that they left. And frankly, often there was no memorial service, there was no funeral. When people would gather, they tended to turn into unhealthy drinking parties or fights. And so we began the process of doing a memorial service when the very first person passed away on the streets, and we found that no one was going to do anything locally. And this was 20 years ago, before it was common to have a cell phone, before it was common to have access to the internet on a regular basis, before social media was a thing. So people were kind of a lot more isolated back then if you didn't keep in touch by phone or by mail. So anyway, we would do memorial services, and the goal of our memorial service was, of course, to memorialize the person who left, but we were trying to establish a pattern of grieving in a healthy way and dealing with the loss. And we want to do that because unprocessed grief tends to come back. And the grief is going to come, I have a saying, the grief is going to come out if you don't deal with it head on. And I don't mean in a forceful way, but in an intentional way. If you don't deal with it intentionally, it's going to come out sideways. And it comes out sideways in really bad ways typically. We snap at people, or we are cruel to ourselves, or we're just depressed. We give up on things, and so on. So we started doing memorial services 20 years ago, and we did, there was a horrible year in which we did a dozen. This also gave us a way to have a handle on how many people are really lost, because there was a lot of statements by people that all my friends are dead, and this let us kind of follow along and learn more about this phenomena. And to be honest, way too many street youth do die, but in fact, a lot of the belief that all my friends are dead was about isolation more than actual death sometimes. Far too many homeless young adults do die, but it wasn't as many as were reported. And so we also began the process of carefully helping people find out that people really aren't dead, that they've either recovered or they've moved to a different place in the city, in the country, or whatever. So we began this process of providing memorial services, and the way we formatted our memorial service, we helped people experience what they miss. So we help people express the sadness by sharing with a group. We gathered at a particular time. It was orderly, if you want to call it that. We didn't allow drinking. It was in a place where we could keep everyone safe from any police wanting to mess with a gathering of homeless people, because believe it or not, that happened and does still happen. So we would express what we miss, how we're sad, and then we would use sad music to help with that process. And then we would change to an upbeat music that fit the person's life or choices, musical choices. And we would share happy memories and laugh. And then we would transition to something sort of in the middle and ask, what are we taking with us? What part of this person is still inside us, and are we leaving this gathering with? And then we would have food and beverage, and sort of create community around this memorial event. And it was quite novel at the time. It was unheard of at the time. People actually couldn't believe we were going to do it. And what we found is people would even come who didn't know the person, weren't close friends, because they still had grief from other times in their life unprocessed. And that's my own experience. I didn't grieve very well at my father's funeral. Because I was the eldest son, I had roles and responsibilities, and I was in shock, and I didn't really do a lot of grief processing at that time. It was actually at the next memorial service that I went with my then wife to a friend of theirs who I wasn't really that close with. She was very close friends with the widow, but I was at that, and I absolutely fell apart at that service. I was really grieving the loss of my father at the next memorial service, and that's very common. And grief comes back, but it tends, if you deal with it intentionally, it tends to come back less strongly and less often over time. So that's a way of dealing with grief, is helping people memorialize it and have some sort of structured event to process it with a community. Grief comes back on anniversaries. A lot of times people have poor behavior all of a sudden, and I've learned that those anniversaries of deaths and birthdays and are surprisingly buried deep inside of us. We may not even be aware of it. And so by asking a few questions like, well, wow, what's going on? It's like, I'm just really sad. It's like, well, could this be the anniversary of something? And all of a sudden people are remembering, this is when my mother passed away, or this is when my child passed away, or this is, my child's birthday that it was taken from me, I lost to some foster care system or something. So all of these griefs are there and often unprocessed. We don't really have a good mechanism for processing grief. The world has a mechanism for processing death, perhaps, through a memorial service, but there's a whole lot of other loss and grief that we don't have mechanisms for processing, and we have to help people with, such as loss of child, separation of child, loss of parents. A lot of street kids have a ton of grief around loss of their American dream, if you will. They were told you need to go to college. They were told you need to get a job. You need to get a house. You need to get all these things, and these dreams are sort of crushed, and they have a loss there. Finally, we have sort of oppressive loss that happens in society, and we're working on that right now. For example, the pandemic has caused young people to lose a tremendous amount. We're doing a project right now where we're asking people to express their grief on paper through either a drawing or a set of words or both. And if they wish, they can turn that piece of paper over or and express hope that they may have even coming out of the pandemic. And a lot of people are combining those. But it's amazing what is coming out through this process, but it's in there, and it causes us to express that grief sideways, which ends up hurting people, ends up hurting ourselves, ends up confusing us. And so dealing with grief and loss head on is something of a skill, and guiding people to deal with that is something of a skill. And if you work with homeless young adults, you're going to have to become more aware of grief and loss in other people's lives, and gently learn how to help them recognize that, and then normalize it for them and help them express it, and if possible, in a natural way, sort of do what we did in that memorial service. Express the sadness, acknowledge the happiness that we miss, but then come to grips with the middle ground, which is, well, I'm glad I experienced that, and I do carry it with me moving forward. I'm glad I had that chance. I'm glad I had that experience. I still have hope. If it's loss of, educational opportunities, like, well, I have learned a ton on the streets already, and I still can, when the time is right for me, find other types of training and learning and education. Maybe college is in the picture, or maybe trade school is in the picture, or maybe just self-learning. There's so much ability to self-learn today. So anyway, those 3 steps, whether it's, grieving the sad part, acknowledging the fact that we're happy about it, and then finding the middle ground to move forward. So that's why we serve. We get to help people with this, and thanks for listening. Bye. Say bye, Rosie. Say bye.